Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Tuesday. As you heard, it's Groundhog Day, a very odd custom in North America where we want to know when spring will come, so we ask a large rodent. It's a groundhog is like a big furry rodent. Okay, so think of like a big rat with no tail. Lives in the ground, and for some reason, the groundhog, people watch, there's an official groundhog, and the groundhog comes out of its hole on February 2nd, and if it sees its shadow, then I think there's going to be 6 more weeks of winter or something. And if it doesn't, then spring is here. Why we ask a rodent this, I have no idea. I don't think they know what the weather is. It's a strange custom. I don't know where it got started. It's bizarre. Maybe it's like an omen thing.
Is it true?
It is not. It is not. The groundhog does not know. And again, where I came from in Edmonton, you're getting 6 more weeks of winter, regardless of it doesn't matter what the groundhog sees. So I don't know what this whole thing is about. It's weird. It's a weird thing. Okay, so. Yesterday we were talking a little bit about the paper that I assigned to you, and I'll talk about that just a little bit more today, and then we'll move on and we'll talk about Egypt. Okay. So far people are just trickling in. So Blake's here. Good morning, Blake. And Michelle's here. Good morning, Michelle. And Adon is here. Good morning to you. Okay. So yesterday I introduced this paper to you, and I told you what I wanted you to do was be able to find an article that is credible and legitimate and believable. I wanted you to be able to read it and understand the argument or the point that it was trying to make. I wanted you to be able to tell me about that in your own words, and then I wanted you to be able to evaluate that argument and kind of respond to it again in your own words, right? That's kind of the whole purpose here. And again, that should say comparative cultures, not social justice, but it's kind of the same exercise with different material, okay? So one thing we didn't talk about yesterday, but this is a bit of a repeat for my social justice people, so bear with me, but it's still important, is how can we tell that a source is credible, okay? How can we know that the thing that we are reading is, that we should actually believe it, right? That it's good quality material. What's that? It's not opinion. Well, this is the thing, is that, that it's not opinion, but if it is opinion, that it's well supported, right? So yeah, like if a highly respected scientist like, I don't know, Dr. Anthony Fauci in the United States tells you that you should be concerned about coronavirus, you should probably be concerned, right? Because the guy is 80 years old. He has spent 50 or 60 years studying communicable disease, right? When he tells you that he's concerned, you should pay attention to him, right? He knows, he's forgotten more about disease than any of us will ever know, right? So yeah, some people's opinion matters, right? Because they have the knowledge and the skill, and we should listen to them, right? And so someone like Dr. Fauci, who's kind of the head of the sort of coronavirus response in the United States, or at least he is now that Joe Biden is the president. Yeah, we should listen to what people have to say, but we can also assess his credibility, right? And so, if you look at, well, actually I'm going to look at it right now since we're talking about it. Yeah, so Anthony Fauci here is he's the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, and he's been the director since 1984, right? So he oversees all of this stuff. He oversees research into infectious disease such as HIV/AIDS, respiratory infections, all kinds of things, Ebola, Zika. The budget for that, for the thing that he runs is $6 billion a year. So he oversees a $6 billion a year National Health Service. He is, let's see, I'm going to look at his, here's his education. So he got a BA at Holy Cross. So he's a doctor. He's a full-on doctor from Cornell. Yeah, and has been studying immunology probably for 60 years, which is longer than we've been alive combined. Right? So, so again, opinion is okay, but it depends on whose opinion it is, right? And when you've got somebody who knows their stuff, yeah, their opinion matters, right? Their opinion is valuable. When it's just some dude in his basement, maybe not so much, right? But anyway, we have to figure out who we should believe, right? How we know things are credible, right? And so if you're looking for an article, I said that if you go through the college library, you can feel pretty safe that you're going to find credible stuff, right? All the stuff in our college library is stuff that's been published by a journal or a newspaper or a magazine, or it's an actual book. And so those things have editors, right? And editors check over what people have written and make sure that it's quality and it's correct and it's well researched and it doesn't contain things that are wrong, right? So we can feel kind of comfortable looking around in the library knowing that what we find is going to be credible, right? So again, if you went to Columbia College website and you clicked on library, and then you clicked on find materials, and then you clicked on all databases A to Z, you would come to a screen that looks like this. And there's all kinds of different databases you can search through to find things. There's a whole bunch of them. You can try them out. MAS Ultra seems to work pretty well, I think, for kind of for social sciences at the high school level. But you can check out other databases as well and see if you can find something in there. And so when you go into these databases, you'll find a little kind of search window like this. And you can enter some search terms. So you can enter, myth and culture, or story and society, or something like that, and see what kind of things come up and see if any of those things might work for you. Sometimes when you do that, I like to check off these. I like to check off full text because I want the full article, right? And sometimes I'll check off just magazines and newspapers as well. So I don't want book reviews. I don't want people's review of another book. I don't want that. I don't usually want biographies. I don't want that. And sometimes I don't want journal articles either, like high academic journal articles. I don't want those. So sometimes I'll filter those out just so I can see, the stuff that will work for me. And again, I would caution you away from like academic journal articles. They tend to be long, they tend to be complex, and they're just a little too much for kind of where we are and what we're doing. So I would steer away from those. If you go out on the internet, if you do free range research, you can encounter all kinds of things, right? Some stuff that's really good, some stuff that is really garbage, right? So we need to know the difference. So I'll suggest a few things to you, okay? One of the things I'll suggest here is pay attention to accuracy. I feel like everyone's on their phones or computers, so maybe I'll ask you, do you want me to go through this, or do you want me to just move on? Because I don't have to. Like I have the belief that maybe you guys don't really know how to do this totally, and so that's kind of why I'm spending time doing it. But if you know all this, then like we could move on. But what do you think? I'll leave it to you, because I can, and of course if you've heard this in social justice, you don't count at the moment. But if you haven't heard this in social justice, do you want me to do this? What's that? Okay. All right. So then eyes up here, and we'll do this, okay? So the first thing you should pay attention to is accuracy, right? So is the writing actually good, right? Whenever I read something and I see a spelling mistake, not student work, but a spelling mistake, it's like, oh, This person doesn't know what they're talking about. And of course that's not true, but it leads me to believe that they haven't really edited it carefully. They haven't polished it. Nobody else has looked at it, right? And that's a red flag for me, right? As soon as I see grammar or spelling errors, I'm like, oh, I don't know. I don't know if I should believe this person. Again, maybe that's a little bit judgmental, but lots of people are like that. So yeah, pay attention. If it's not written very well, it's probably not researched very well either. It's probably not thought out very well. So accuracy means something. Look at the author, right? See if you can figure out who wrote something. If you know who wrote it, that's a good step. If you can Google them and actually find information on them, that's even better, right? So if I find something online written by, Anthony Fauci, and I'm like, oh, who's this Anthony Fauci dude? And I Google him and I find out that, oh, he's been studying infectious disease for 60 years, then that's good, right? It's like, oh, this guy really knows what he's talking about. I can feel comfortable believing him. If you can't find any information on them, or if you don't know who they are, it's probably not a good sign, right? So being able to figure out who they are and then see if you should listen to them, right? Are they a history professor or a sociology professor? Great. Are they, just a hobby person who likes this kind of thing? Okay, maybe okay. But if you can't find any information on them, we don't really know who they are or what they know, or if we should trust them, right? Currency, is this information current? And so this will depend on what you're looking for. If we're talking about story and culture, you might find an article that's 20 years old, and that's okay, right? Because we're not talking about current events. We're not talking about things that are happening right now. In social justice, if we're writing a paper, it's probably a good idea to find something more recent, right? Because social justice issues and perspectives are kind of changing and evolving. And if you look 20 years ago, you might find the perspective will be a little different, right? So current is better. For this class, it doesn't have to be quite so current. Is it fair? This is the tricky thing, right? Because I'm asking you to find an article that has an argument, right? That has an opinion. And so just because something has a point to prove doesn't mean that it's not valid, right? There's lots of things out there that are trying to convince you of something, and that's okay. It's just, is the person offering a fair argument? Is the person trying to convince you in a way that is logical and rational, right? We don't want people who are trying to convince us with scare tactics, right? If Joe Biden and the Democrats win the election, the US will turn into a socialist hell, and you'll have all of your rights taken away and it will be pure communism, right? That's not a legitimate argument. None of those things are going to happen, and it's trying to scare people, right? It's not a good argument, right? You want people who are going to try and convince you with logical arguments and logical premises, but aren't trying to scare you or make things or blow things out of proportion, right? Joe Biden is not going to turn the US into a socialist country. It's just not going to happen, right? So we want people who are, a little bit balanced, but they can still come down on one side of an issue or the other. They can still have a point to prove as long as they're doing it fairly, right? If they're not, if they're, using a bunch of emotionally triggering words, if they're trying to scare you, if they're trying to make you angry, it's probably not a great opinion piece. Although you could read something and still be angry, right? So it's okay. Depending on the topic, it could make you angry, but they shouldn't be trying to use your emotions against you, is what I'm saying. And the last one is kind of relevance. Is it relevant to your topic? Well, hopefully, because that's what you're going to look for when you, you're not going to read an article on something else. I don't know why it's in there. I didn't make this up. But look for fairness. Look for that emotional language. Look for people trying to get you upset or fearful, right? That's usually a bad sign. Look and see if you can figure out who the author is and who the publication is, where it comes from, and then look for accuracy. How well is it written? If it's not written very well, it's not researched very well, it's not thought out very well, I would question it, okay? The second thing we'll talk about is plagiarism, okay? And this is an important topic because it happens, people do it. Sometimes they do it purposely, sometimes they do it accidentally, and we want to kind of understand what it is so that we don't do it accidentally, right? If you purposely plagiarize something, I have no sympathy for you, but if you accidentally do it, that sucks, and we need to try and avoid accidentally cheating, right? We don't want to do that. So this is what plagiarism is. The short version is when you take someone else's ideas or words or thoughts and you pass them off as your own. You present them as your own words or thoughts, either accidentally or on purpose, right? So the trick here is that academics and writers use other people's ideas and work all the time, okay? So if you look at your average academic article, they'll have like 2 pages of references at the end. That's all work that they have borrowed. That's all stuff that they have kind of climbed up on top of to make their point, right? So it's totally okay to do this. We just have to make sure we cite things properly. We just have to make sure we reference it, right? And so what we have to learn how to do is learn how to treat the words and ideas of others, and then how to cite them, how to properly cite them, okay? So we can treat people's ideas or words in 2 ways. We can quote it or we can paraphrase it. Paraphrasing, you're basically saying what someone else has said, but in your own words, okay? So here's an example. I'll get to that in a second. Here's an example. So social justice people, you'll have read this already, but read it again just in case. It's a good skill. So it talks a little bit about students overusing quotations, and it recommends that we, minimize our use of quotations in our writing, okay? And you can see at the end here, this comes from a book called Writing Research Papers, written by a James Lester, whoever that is. So here's a good paraphrase of it at the bottom. So read that section for me. Not out loud, but just read it. Okay, so see what he did there? Or she. Basically said the same thing, right? Said the same. So James Lester said one thing. Here we have a paraphrase. It communicates the same information, but it does it with different words, right? And at the end, there's a nice little citation, right? And we always want to do that too. We want to say, thank you, right? So James Lester has this idea that you should limit your quotes when you write research papers. And this person here has taken James Lester's idea, restated it, and said, thanks, James, right? And that's what that little thing is there. And so you are perfectly allowed to do this. This is totally 100% legal, right? James had the idea that you should do this. You can restate it, thank James Lester, and then move on, right? So again, this is kind of like a little thank you, or if you want to think about it like tagging people in Instagram, it's kind of the same thing. You're tagging James Lester in your paper, right? Same idea. This one is kind of similar, but it's an even shorter summary. So just because James has a lot of detail in his original passage doesn't mean all that detail needs to make it into your summary, right? So here just, students should take a few notes in direct quotation to help them minimize the amount of quoted material in a research paper. That's basically what he said, right? It's a very short summary of what he said, and again, we've got Lester 4647. Thank you, James, right? Now here's what we don't want to do. So this version is plagiarized. So have a look at it. And I think you'll see what I mean. What's that?
Without reading it, it's plagiarism.
Without reading it? How do you know?
There's no text citation.
Ah, so Baha's pointed out an important point. A, there is no text citation, right? So there's no thank you.
I saw like the sentence in the middle.
Yep. Yeah, it's exactly the same, right? And so there's a sentence that's the same, but also they've kind of thesaurused the other ones, right? So students frequently overuse, students often use too many, right? Direct quotations when they take notes, direct quotations in taking notes. And as a result, they overuse quotations, resulting in too many of them in the final research. Yeah, you're saying exactly the same thing. You're just doing a little switcheroo with the words, right? No, no, right?
He's trying to tell students to not cheat.
He's what?
So is he telling students to not cheat or not like plagiarize?
Like in this original section? What he's saying is, and actually, press pause on that and I'll come back to it because I do want to answer that question, but I'll answer it in 3 minutes. Okay. So here we have a plagiarized version, right? And so as Baha's pointed out very astutely, there is no citation, so that's a problem. The other problem is that it's too close, right? So whoever wrote this copy and pasted directly from James Lester, and then they went in and switched a few words. That's no good, right? You either completely restate it in your own words, or you put the little quotes, you put the little air bunnies, and you quote it word for word. You cannot, this is no good, right? You've got to say it in your own words, more like the first version that we saw, okay? So again, when you're paraphrasing or when you're writing based on someone else's work, you want to read it, you want to understand it, and then you want to turn around and say it in your own words as best you can. Okay, so that's really what you want to do. Okay, this is going to lead you into plagiarismville, right? Even if you cite it, it's still too close. Like it's still too close to the original. Okay. The second part is quoting. Okay, and so if you quote, you're putting the little quotation marks around it, and you're saying exactly what the person said, right? All the punctuation, all the capitalization, everything is exactly as it comes from the original source, okay? So here I've got a little quote from one of our prime ministers in 1904. Not one of, we only had one in 1904, but from one of our prime ministers, comma, in 1904, comma, Sir Wilfrid Laurier. And Laurier is talking about how the 20th century is going to be the century of Canada, and everyone will look to Canada as an inspiration towards what to look for, right? Go Canada. So this is a direct quote, right? It's Wilfrid Laurier's exact words from the day. By the way, Laurier's the guy on the $5 bill, if anyone uses real money anymore, which probably not, but if you do, he's on the $5 bill. I would suggest, and what James Lester was suggesting, is that you really not quote at all, okay? So one reason is that, when I'm marking, or when anyone's reading your work, they really want to read you, right? Like, I want to be reading your work. I don't want to read 4 lines about what Wilfrid Laurier said. That doesn't tell me anything about what you know, except for the fact that you know how to copy and paste what someone else said. And that's not, I know you know how to do that. I know you all get 100 in copying and pasting. I know you can do it. But I want to see your thinking. I want to see what you can tell me and how you understand things. So I want to hear your voice. I don't want to hear Wilfrid Laurier's voice. The second thing is that most students tend to overuse them. And number one, because they're space filler. Sorry, but we've all done it. we all needed an extra few lines to make our word count, so we throw in something that'll get us there. But the other thing is that they generally don't help what you're saying. They definitely get in the way, right? So have you ever had a friend, like, you know, you're hanging out with your friends and you're telling a story, and then there's a friend that like jumps in the middle of your story and says something, and it doesn't, like, it gets in the way of what you're trying to say, and you're like, dude, just, I know, right? It's like, just shut up for a minute so I can tell my story, right? And that's kind of, I feel, what happens with students using quotations, is that the quotation is almost the annoying friend, right? Because you're like, okay, you're writing and you're trying to say something, and then in comes this quote that isn't perfectly connected to what you're trying to say, and then when the quote is over, you have to try and get back to what you were saying in the first place. And it screws up the story, right? It interferes with what you're trying to tell me. And so in almost all cases, in almost all student writing that I've seen, this is the case, is that the quote just gets in the way of what you're really trying to say. Okay, so I would say don't quote, paraphrase everything, don't quote anything. The only example is if you really need to hear the exact words. And in social justice, I gave the example of George Floyd, right, who died, was it in April of last year? April or May? Yeah, maybe in the early part of last year, George Floyd, a black American who died because a police officer was kneeling on his neck. And his last words before he died were, "I can't breathe," right? So those are words that if they wouldn't show up in a paper in this class, but if they showed up, you needed to use them, you should quote them, right? Because those are powerful words, right? You wouldn't type, and George Floyd informed officers that he was having trouble getting air into his lungs, right? Like, that's a paraphrase, but it doesn't work, right? It doesn't have the same effect. "I can't breathe" is a very powerful, simple statement, and you need to hear the words, right? Paraphrasing doesn't work there. It gets in the way, right? So again, there's some instances where you really need to hear the words, or if you were writing an English essay, right? What does this poet mean when he says, you know, oh God, what do poets say? "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day," right? So you might need to quote Shakespeare when you're talking about that, because each of his words are important, right? But again, if you were talking about James Lester's thing, I wouldn't quote that. You could say it better on your own. You don't need to hear each word, right? But there are some instances, like, you know, English, if you're trying to analyze a poem, or if you're trying to convey the emotion of what someone said, right? "I can't breathe." That's a powerful statement, especially because it's the last thing that man ever said, right? So that's a powerful thing. What James Lester said, sorry James, but I don't think we need to quote you. we can summarize what you've said. That's enough, right? So again, don't get yourself into trouble with this. Ideas and things that you borrow from other sources, yeah, they need to be cited, okay? The only other piece of information I'll give you here, which might be helpful, is that you don't have to cite things that are common knowledge, okay? So Joe Biden was elected President of the United States in the November 2020 election. Don't cite that. We all know it. It's common knowledge. It was reported by media outlets over the entire world. Don't cite it. We all know it, right? Earth has one moon. Don't cite it. We all know that, right? So things that are kind of common knowledge, don't cite, right? But things that a certain person says, like Jared Diamond says that switching to agriculture was the worst mistake in the history of the human race, that should be cited, right? Because that's his thing, right? That's his statement. So you've got to kind of intuitively make the distinction between stuff that everybody knows and things that maybe only a few people know or a specific person has said, okay? So that's how you kind of figure out what you need to cite, okay? Yeah, so I would say don't quote. Most of the time it's not necessary. It just gets in the way. It doesn't tell me anything other than you can copy and paste. So you'll do much better if you don't quote, for the most part. Yeah. Citations, I'll leave those to you, but there's kind of two citations. So you do, when you're writing something and you use someone else's idea, you do a little in-text citation. So there's Lester 4647, so we know where that piece of information comes from. And then at the end, you do a works cited, right? And so I like to think of this as the ingredient list. So when you finish writing your paper, tell me the ingredients, right? What went into this thing? Flour, sugar, eggs, a little bit of Karl Marx. Tell me where you got your information so that I can find it and see it too, right? All academics do this, and we'll do it as well, okay? So as I say, you give a little thank you in the text when you use someone else's material. You say, thanks, James. And then at the end, you give the ingredient list. What are the ingredients in this paper beyond your brain? Easy peasy lemon squeezy? Huh? Kind of. It's a little tricky, but don't worry. Right, so in this assignment, I'm asking you to find an article and pull the argument out of it. And fortunately, we did that already, right? We read Jared Diamond's article, and we pulled the argument out of that, right? We said that humans' switch to agriculture was a big mistake, right? That was his main point, right? And we could say that. I could say humans' choice to switch to farming subsistence strategy was a huge mistake. Bracket, Diamond, 1999, or whenever it was, right? So I could cite that. I didn't cite it here, but that was our conclusion. And we said that there were some premises, right? That farmers saw a decline in their health as compared to hunter-gatherers. Class divisions seem to have developed from this switch to farming, as did sexual inequality. We kind of said that that was his argument. So if we were doing this, if this was a paper, I would want you to explain just that. Explain what Jared Diamond was talking about. Well, in this article, he talks about the switch to farming, how it happened. These were his premises that supported his conclusion. And he explained that even though this seemed to have been a huge mistake, humans were kind of forced into it, right? Because their populations were rising and they had to put some energy back into the land to raise the carrying capacity, to produce more food, to feed more people, right? And so you would kind of have a paragraph or so that would explain that argument and explain how Jared made his case. And then you would respond to it. And so let's try that now. What did you think of that argument? Did you agree? Did you disagree? Were there things that maybe you think that Jared Diamond overlooked? Were there questions that you had?
Somehow exaggerated when he said it's a huge mistake. If we do not switch to agriculture, we won't stay in one place. We won't have culture. We won't have buildings. We won't establish anything. We can't find our history.
Sure.
Also, we need other nutritionists, we need other plants, like to ourselves.
Exactly. So one of the things that I was trying to convince you of was the idea that this was a massive change, maybe the biggest change that human beings have ever been through. And that switch to agriculture has made everything about our modern lives possible. And like when we look at our modern lives, it's kind of pretty good, don't you think? I think we live in a pretty decent time. I think we're all comfortable. People aren't running around chopping off other people's heads very often, so that's nice. We have medicine, we have Netflix, we have lots of tasty food. Pop-Tarts are a thing. I mean, this is not a bad time to be alive. And again, if all of the stuff that we enjoy today was made possible by the switch to agriculture, how can you say it was a mistake, right? We've been able to do amazing things, right? We've walked on the moon. We've cured many infectious diseases and vaccinated people. We've educated people. Many of us live comfortable lives. How can you say that this was a mistake, right? So there's that, right? You could respond to Jared Diamond's argument and say, I disagree, Jared, because I think the world we live in is pretty awesome in terms of the experiences that humans have had, and that wouldn't have happened without agricultural revolution. So I think you're wrong. Valid, right? You could make a little case for that. What else? How else could you respond to Jared Diamond?
I think the mistake they've done is not like when they switch to agriculture, they're start feeding themselves from plants, and they like step away from hunting and get like neutral food from animals. They made a mistake without like sustaining their
Health?
healthcare needs.
Okay, so the idea is that, maybe this wasn't a huge mistake, but they just did it wrong, right? Maybe they focused too much on one crop, right? Maybe they should have grown multiple crops, or maybe they should have kept more animals, or maybe they should have continued to hunt in some way, right? So maybe it wasn't the choice was wrong, they just did it the wrong way, right? It's the execution is wrong, but the choice wasn't bad, right? Which is possible, right? We make good choices all the time and then screw it all up, right? That's a very human thing to do, is to, try to make a good choice and fail spectacularly. But so that's a way you could respond. What else? Can you think of anything else? Other ways to respond to Jared?
Other ways? Other ways? I guess tell him
Those-
you are stupid.
Yeah, but that's actually that's interesting. So, yeah, we could just say, Jared, you're stupid. However, if we Google searched him and tried to find out who he was, we would probably find that he's probably a credible person. I think he has a medical degree, actually. I think he's a doctor as well, and a historian, and he's written 3 or 4 books, which again doesn't mean that he's perfectly credible, but it's good evidence. But what you're suggesting is what's called an ad hominem attack, okay? So the idea is someone makes an argument, right? Jared Diamond makes an argument, and instead of debating his argument or challenging it, we just attack him. Jared, you're just a bozo. What do you know? Right? So, which is very tempting and very easy to do, but it's pretty bad form, and it doesn't really help us get to the truth, right? And again, I'm not pointing a finger at you, Baha, but lots of people do this in real life, right? On social media or in the media in general, they attack each other, right? And you don't want to attack each other. You want to attack the idea, right? And say, Jared, I see what you're saying here, but I think you've miscalculated, or I think you should pay a little more attention to how good human life is right now. Or, yeah, they made a mistake, or maybe they didn't make a mistake, but they just didn't, they didn't manage it very well. They didn't execute very well. That's all. You're being too harsh, Jared. There's another way to see this. That's what we want to do. We don't want to just attack Jared. That's no good. Although lots of people do that, and it's very tempting to just say, "Ugh, what an idiot! Shut up." Right? It's much easier to do that, and it's even a little satisfying. But that's not what we want to do. So yeah, in your paper, that's kind of what I'm asking you to do, is just like we did with this paper, figure out the argument, explain it to me, and then respond, right? And maybe even make your own argument and say, Jared, I think you're I think you're being a little too harsh. I think that yes, they actually made a good choice, but they didn't do such a good job. And here's why I think so, right? So you can actually build your own little argument in response to Jared's, right? And so that would be great. I'd love to see you be able to understand an argument and either explain why you agree with that person, or explain why you're challenging them, right? Why you're saying, hey, Jared, I think you're a little off. I think you're a little off base here. I think this is the important thing, or you've forgotten to consider this, or how can you say that all of this is not great, or whatever. That's kind of where I want you to go in terms of response. Does that make sense? To help out? Okay. I'm very interested to see what you guys will find and write. The other thing I'll mention too is that if you find an article and you're not sure about it, you can always send me an email and with the link to the article and say, hey Mike, do you think this is okay? Do you think this will work? And then I can give you the thumbs up or the maybe keep looking. Okay? So that's possible too. I can help you out that way and be a second set of eyes. Okay? That took a little longer than I thought, but that's okay. I think it was good. Would you like to take a little break?
If you wish to give us one.
I wish to give you, I, the great and beneficent teacher, wish to grant you a break. Therefore, I will.
You deserve it.
Yes, you do. I'll see you in 10 minutes. We'll talk about Egypt. Okay, and we are back. So I think that'll do it for the kind of paper stuff for now. Again, if you have questions after this, you can certainly ask me. But yeah, I'm kind of curious to see what you write, and kind of based on you know how that turns out, maybe I can offer some more comments after they get turned in. But is there, maybe since I'm on the topic, is there anything that you would like me to talk about in terms of paper writing that might be useful?
When is the deadline?
Next Friday. Next Friday, yeah. Oh yeah, and the assignment is, it's listed in Teams. So in Teams there's a little assignments bar, like you know where we have files. Assignments is there too, and I'll ask you to submit through assignments as well. You can click on it, and there's a little add resources, and you just attach your file, your Word document or whatever it is to that, and then I'll have everything turned in one place, and I won't lose them or have to chase them around like I did last term, and it was a bit of a disaster. So yeah, I'll ask you to do that. Yeah, is there anything else you'd like me to talk about, either right now or yeah?
Do you want handwritten ones, or we can type and send?
I would very much prefer it if you typed it for me. Yes, thank you. That's way easier for me to read. I'm sure your handwriting is lovely, but much easier. Huh? Okay.
Is there a specific font or word size or like the
Font and word size. I think the best and easiest to read is the font and the size that most people are used to, and so it's here in kind of North America, it's Times New Roman, 12-point font, and I usually do like a 1.2 space. 1-point space feels a little crowded to me, but double space feels really big, unless you're going to write notes in it, which I usually don't. So like 1.2 kind of works for me, and that's kind of standard in North America. It's easy to read, and it looks kind of clean and neat and professional, and yeah.
Is it like really you can easily read Times New Roman? I find it like really like squeezed.
Yeah, you know, it would be. It's interesting to think about that in terms of, because I'm sure like you didn't learn to read in English first. You learned to read in Arabic, or yeah, you learned to read in Arabic first, and Arabic alphabet is much different looking than the English one, right? It's very, yeah, it's beautiful, right? To see things written in Arabic, it's beautiful. Like it's very there's some artistry there. But yeah, I've kind of wondered about that. If you grew up with a particular type of script, and then to look at English, it's like, oh, what is easy to read, right? Or what's good. I know with Times it's pretty standard, and it's also called a serif font. Okay, and this is, you don't need to know this, but serif fonts have, like, if you have a, let me see. Let me just see if I can pull something up and show you.
I feel like Times New Roman, like it has too much lines that very close to each other.
Right.
It's like almost a box and the likeness of it, or dimensions.
Right.
That's what I feel.
I'm just going to do this here really quick, just since we're talking about it. We probably shouldn't spend any time talking about this, but so right. So yeah, here's a Times. I'm going to zoom in. Woo! So there's a Times New Roman font, and it's a serif font. And what the serif is you see these little like, well, I don't know what to call them. Little extensions or something. Apparently, those are there to help you. They help you transition from letter to letter, so they help your eye move, and they are apparently easier to read. Whereas something like I don't know. Well, here, this is the one I use all the time. Here, this is like my That one that's a sans serif font, so it has no serifs, it has no tails, and apparently this is much more difficult to read, in terms of long passages than is something like this that has these little tails, apparently. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I've heard. But yeah, that's here in North America. That's usually the standard thing. And again, I would go 12 point. I would go 12 point font. Doesn't look 12 point there, but yeah, I would go 12 point font, and I would space it probably 1.2 is what I would go with. Not too crowded, not too stretched out. I usually don't monkey with the margins. I just leave that as it is. Yeah. That's kind of the most. And then for the, if there's a title to the piece, of course I'll make that. I'll make that much bigger. I'll maybe bold it or something. But anyway, that's not a huge deal, but that's what I usually do. Okay. Other questions? Okay, moving on. Nope, that's not the right one. Oops, this is the right one. Okay, so we finished Mesopotamia yesterday, and we said that this was a notable civilization, a notable culture, because a lot of firsts happen here. And again, there's a few different civilizations around the world developing at this time, but Mesopotamia showed us or gave us some of our earliest evidence of writing, of urbanization, of monumental architecture, of a complex civilization and cities with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people living in them and kind of working together, right? And that was all, that was all made possible by the switch to intensive agriculture, craft specialization, and this kind of development of an administration, right? Either priests or rulers that were kind of above the general people and kind of ran society. And so it's a pretty impressive development, and it's especially impressive because it happens quickly, right? It's only a few thousand years to get this level of complexity when humans were hunting and gathering for hundreds of thousands of years with really, not much changed, right? Things were, living as a hunter-gatherer 100,000 years ago was pretty much the same as living as a hunter-gatherer 50,000 years ago. Not much difference. But then populations go up, technological innovation goes up, and complexity increases as well, right? So really kind of interesting stuff starts to happen with that switch to agriculture. And of course, that will continue on, right, as things become more politically and socially and economically and technologically complicated. But let's talk about Egypt. Egypt was one of my favorite civilizations for a long time. I'm not sure. There's something kind of romantic and mystical about Egypt, and I don't know what it is. I think ancient Egypt has kind of captured the imagination of at least the West for a long period of time. People have been kind of visiting Egypt and sort of marveling at its wonders for quite some time, to the point where if you go into the pyramids or some other sort of ancient sites in Egypt, you can actually see graffiti that was left there by Greek and Roman tourists from 2,000-3,000 years ago as well. So there were even, Romans and Greeks were going there as tourists and looking at this stuff and going, wow, this is amazing, and then graffitiing it for some reason. But either way, it's been a source of fascination for quite some time. So in this kind of, in this little unit or whatever on Egypt, we'll try and talk about the culture and the environment, their politics and their power, interactions and exchanges the Egyptians had with others. Culture and environment is in there twice. That's just how important it is, I guess. Or it's a typo. how any conflicts or conflict resolution they may have had, their values and beliefs, and their cultural expressions, their art and things like that. So again, like Mesopotamia, Egypt is one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, and it's an interesting example of kind of how this civilization kind of develops, has connections to other areas, but also kind of develops on its own as well. Okay, and the sort of history of ancient Egypt, at least for cultural purposes, really begins around 5,000 years ago when Upper and Lower Egypt are united, and then Egypt remains kind of a united whole for most of its ancient history. Okay, so right there it's a little bit different from Mesopotamia, because Mesopotamia was a bunch of city-states that were constantly fighting with each other and warring with each other until kind of an empire was created. But Egypt was kind of a united whole for a long time. Yeah, so Egypt is really all about the Nile River. This is one of the first historians that we have writings from, Herodotus. He's Greek. And Herodotus wrote this. He writes, "Egypt is the gift of the Nile," which is very poetic and often quoted. But it is true, because really without the river, there's nothing there. You just have a big, big sandbox, right? What's that?
Desert.
Yeah, you just have desert. You have nothing without the Nile. And for the ancient Egyptians, they kind of divided their world into the black land and the red land. And so the black land was Kemet, which is the blackness has to do with the sort of soil that would be deposited on the fields when the Nile would flood, right? Just like we talked about in Mesopotamia. And the red land was the desert, right? Egypt is amazing. That's what that slide says. So let me get to yes. So a few pictures just to kind of get us in the headspace of where this is. I think it's a very beautiful country. In the pictures I've seen, I've never been there, but I would like to go someday. And again, the river is kind of everything here. And the river serves as transportation for the Egyptians, but it also served as a source of life, a source of water, a source of fertilizer for their fields. They fished in it, they hunted from it. It was really the source of everything for Egypt. Yeah, it's hard to take a bad picture in this part of the world, I think. It's very stunning. Although I do love these pictures because it looks like these pyramids are off in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere. But really the suburb of Giza is like right there. So like from one perspective, you look and it's like, oh, pristine desert. But if you turn around, there's like buildings in a city right behind you. So it's not quite so isolated as sometimes it looks in pictures, right? But
I think that's all that they have from pyramids, right?
what's that?
I think these only the pyramids they have.
No, there's something like
200 something?
I think there's something like 60 or 80 pyramids in Egypt. These are the biggest ones, and they're certainly the most photographed ones, but there's a lot of pyramids in Egypt. These are just kind of the best examples. All right, so here, look at the satellite map of Egypt. So you can pretty clearly see that it's all about the Nile here, right? And really the only place that humans can live in this country is right next to the river and kind of in the river delta that you can see as well, because there's just no habitable land anywhere else, right? It's all dry, hot desert. So you can see how the Egyptians would have wanted to develop intensive agriculture here early, because as their populations grew, could they just expand? No, right? They had nowhere to go because there was no arable land. There was nowhere to farm outside of the river valley. So they had to be more productive in their farming activities to survive, and they did. So, what's that?
118.
118. Yeah, there's 118 pyramids. Wow. The other thing that's kind of nice about this is, though, even though they were limited in terms of their farmland here, their geography also protected them, because Egypt was kind of a really difficult place to get to thousands of years ago. You would have to trek across the desert for weeks.
No compass, no GPS.
Yeah, no compasses, no GPS. Boats were very kind of rudimentary at the time. They didn't have big seagoing boats. So getting to Egypt was pretty difficult, which is good, because if it's difficult to get there, it means that it's difficult to get an army in there to take over as well, right? So Egypt was kind of sheltered from other parts of the world, and whereas the Mesopotamian city-states were always fighting with each other, and then an empire came in and took them over, and then another empire came in and took them over. Egypt was kind of spared from that for a long time, because they were just difficult to get to. It was difficult to attack them because the desert was, the desert protected them. Yeah, so their kind of geography and their sort of natural setting helped them to kind of stay protected, and allowed them to kind of develop in a very kind of peaceful, relaxed way. And so Egypt is kind of, they were isolated from other places. They were protected from other armies, and they had a climate and a cycle of river flooding that was very kind of gentle and predictable. And so the Egyptians kind of didn't have the same sorts of concerns and fears and uncertainty that the Mesopotamians had. And so as a result, their culture kind of developed in a different way. And so the Egyptians had a very kind of positive outlook on life and the afterlife and all of these things. Remember the Mesopotamian idea of when you die, you just kind of go to this dark place and sit there and eat ash or whatever, and that's all that happens? Ugh, right? But for the Egyptians, their idea of an afterlife was a paradise that was just like this world, but even better, right? And so they kind of had this very optimistic, positive, sunny outlook that probably in part came from their history, which was also very positive and predictable and probably enjoyable. Again, the river is the important thing here, and the Egyptians very early on start to build irrigation canals and dikes and systems that allow their crops to be watered and their fields to be flooded. But again, because the river flooded predictably every year, and because it would bring all of this rich organic material and deposit it on the fields every year, Egyptian agriculture was really productive. So they could actually grow two full crops a year in Egypt using this method. And so that gave them a huge food surplus, and again, it built everything else. So all of the kind of wealth of Egypt, whether you're thinking about monuments or gold or art or whatever, all of that's built on the fact that they were growing huge amounts of food, right? And that means that, a few people have to be farmers, but then other people are free to do other things, right? And they did a lot of other things in Egypt. Yeah, so I've shown you this picture before, but this is from Egypt, from a tomb wall, and we see a guy farming probably like they did, right, with oxen and a plow and planting crops, right? Again, this is a bit of it's a bit of imagination. It looks a little too perfect, but you get the idea, right, is that the Egyptians had these large fields of millet and grain that they would grow. They had built irrigation ditches to get water from the river into their crops so that they could water them. You can see here some people in the front. They're kind of harvesting the crop and separating the wheat from the chaff, if you will. And then a bunch of little storage buildings in the back where they would store away their grain, maybe for sale or maybe for next year or whatever. The Egyptians watered their crops in part using these shadoofs. And so it's kind of a counterweight thing, so you can very easily dip a bucket in the water and fling the water on your crops And it's pretty easy to use, right? Because you've got this counterweight. Just the beginning of Egyptian ingenuity. Like I mentioned, they grew lots of different crops. They grew barley and flax and wheat, but they also had smaller areas where they grew fruits and vegetables. And so people would work on larger farms, but they would also have a vegetable garden. And so the Egyptians had a reasonably kind of diverse menu of foods. And again, if you can water your crops, it's a great growing environment, right? It's really sunny, it's really nice and warm, and the Egyptians were able to grow all kinds of different things. Unlike Mesopotamia, Egypt was very rich in natural resources. What do we say about Mesopotamia? What kind of natural resources did they have? Clay. Yay. Clay and
Copper.
yeah, maybe a little bit. What's that?
Mud.
Mud. Yeah, they had clay, they had mud, maybe a little bit of metal, and they had their agricultural production. That's kind of all they had. They had to trade for everything else. But Egypt had all kinds of good stuff, right? So they had the food surplus, but they had all kinds of, they had gold and silver. They had all kinds of different gemstones that they could mine from their territory. They had good building stone, limestone and granite within their borders. They had all kinds of great natural resources that they were able to use, and they didn't even have to trade for it. And so again, this is a very rich civilization from the get-go, right? They had a lot of food, but they also had a lot of natural resources that they could use to build their civilization, and of course, build it they did. Well, I guess you saw that. So to start off here, I'd like you to read this section on ancient Egypt, and it talks a little bit about the very beginning of Egyptian civilization as we know it, starting in 31 BC, or 3100 BCE, about 5,000 years ago, and talks a little bit about the sort of beginning of that, who and what the pharaoh is, a little bit about Egyptian writing, and maybe some other innovations. So this is an introduction to Egypt that I'd like you to read. As you can see, I have page numbers, page 41 to something, and I'm just going to see what page I wanted you to go to. 41 is not even correct. It's 42. There's Narmer. Yeah, I think it's 42 to 45 is what it is. So yeah, please read pages 42 to 45. You should be able to answer those questions, and then we'll discuss them, okay? just another minute or so. Okay, people. So, got a few minutes left, but let's just talk about what's happening in Egypt here around 3600 to 3300 BC. What's going on? What's that? Sorry? Trading. Yeah, there's some trading going on up and down the Nile, right? What else do we hear about? What's that? Yeah, that's going to come a little bit later, but yeah, the Egyptians are going to develop their own writing system, right? It's possible that they might have gotten the idea from the Mesopotamians, the idea to write things down, but their writing system is totally different from cuneiform, so they certainly didn't copy it, but they might have got the idea there. You never know. What else? Say again?
There were two parts to Egypt, south and north.
Right. So Egypt starts out kind of roughly divided into two kingdoms, if you will, right? An upper Egypt and a lower Egypt. And so they figured this out based on the way the river flows. And so upper Egypt is actually in the southern part of Egypt because that's where the river comes from. The river flows from south to north. And lower Egypt is the northern part with the river delta, right? So yeah, there's two. Egypt starts out divided into two kind of kingdoms. What else? What else is happening?
They moved closer to the river
Yeah. Why did they do that?
Because climate change and people can't live like too far away from the river because there's no water.
Yeah. So the Egypt kind of closer to 5,000 years ago was a little bit kind of wetter than we know Egypt to be today, right? So as you know, Earth's climate has been fluctuating for its entire history, and so we're kind of moving into a period where things are becoming warmer and drier, and places where you could farm before can't really farm anymore. They're drying out, and so people are forced to move closer to the river, and that's where they can live and farm. And so that's going to cause populations next to the river to rise, and people are going to have to be kind of more strategic about their farming activities, right? What else?
The Nile brought life into Egypt.
Yeah, the Nile brings life to Egypt, right? And again, the the Egyptians recognize that, right? They have a hymn to the Nile saying, "Oh, great Nile, thank you for bringing life to our country," right? So Herodotus said that Egypt is the gift of the Nile, but of course the Egyptians pretty clearly recognize that as well. What else? What else do we learn about?
There was growing up
There was what?
They have dry weather
Oh,
aside from the Nile.
right. It's a very dry, desertified landscape outside of the Nile. Yeah, so there's a religion happening here that of course is very rich and diverse, and which we'll hear about very shortly.
Also, civilization based on religious beliefs, cultural beliefs.
Right. So as we'll see in more detail shortly, the Egyptian civilization or the Egyptian state is heavily religious, right? And so, you know, nowadays, at least in the West here, we usually try to have a separation between church and state. We don't really like the church interfering in state politics, but that's not the case in all modern countries, and it certainly is not the case in ancient Egypt, where everything is religious. I mean, your king is seen as a god, right? If your king is a god, everything that happens has a religious significance, right? There's more to this, but we're kind of fresh out of time here, so let's call it for today. We'll come back tomorrow and we'll learn a little bit more about our Egyptian friends. Okay, so that is all for today. Good work. I will see you tomorrow.